Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today, we're going to be talking about the new album from Modest Mouse, titled Strangers to Ourselves. It's a dream story of any indie rock band. Well, at least the first half of it is. I mean, you start off with a ramshackle, rough-edged sound that catches the ear thanks to solid melodic interplay and distinctive vocals. That's just enough to entice people to actually read into your lyrics. And while those lyrics might be a little bit disjointed and indulgent on that first album, your second release, it cleans things up significantly, refines the storytelling, and ends up creating a critically acclaimed gem that really deserves it. One that actually managed to snag the appeal and attention of a major label. And immediately, your fans all tense up. Would you lose your sound in favor of something that was more popular in the mainstream? Would you be just another band that sold out? But yet somehow, against all odds, you use the major label influence and budget to only further refine your sound and improve that mix. And your newest release is even more critically acclaimed. And there are still a fair few number of fans who prefer your sophomore release, but they can at least respect the cohesion and added polish that comes with time and more ambition. And then somehow on your next album from said major label, a single somehow manages to catch fire not just on rock radio but everywhere. Suddenly you're not just critically acclaimed, but you've got an earworm of a hit and you're dropping an album that goes platinum, something you never would have possibly expected or predicted. Now this was the story of Modest Mouse, as you probably already know. It seemed like for 4 albums since their debut in the mid-90s, they could do no wrong. And then something happened. Their 2007 follow-up, We Were Dead Before the Ship Sank, to their 2004 major breakout, it wasn't bad. Taking a loose nautical theme for their typical brand of manic depression and confusion, yeah, it was decent, but I don't know if it was the much cleaner production, the slightly more commercial focus, or somewhere that just felt a few shades less sharp than their absolute best, but it didn't really click with me very well. To me, that trademark raw fluid power had been eased back, even with the added talents of the Smiths guitarist Johnny Marr. And the thing was, it wasn't bad music per se, it just didn't seem to have that same innovative spark to it. Well, from that, Modest Mouse seemed to drop off the face of the earth, with only an extended EP in 2009 to show any sort of real progress. But now, 8 years later, we've got a new Modest Mouse album, and I'm finally getting a chance to cover it. Yeah, I know I'm late to the punch here, but going through that entire discography in depth, it took a long time. I really wanted to make sure I understood those lyrics. So, do Strangers to Ourselves hold up to their best? Well, honestly, I'm conflicted about this record. I'm not gonna say it's a bad album. In terms of its composition, there's more going on that I like in comparison with their last album, but it's also a stiffer, slightly more predictable album that revisits a lot of themes that Modest Mouse has already trodden well in their past, and doesn't really add much to their usual blend of existential confusion and depression. And when it does add, okay, we'll get to it. Coupled with the layers of sarcasm and even less subtlety than usual, it's the sort of record that I end up appreciating a fair bit more than I actually like, which is a shame because I really wanted to like this album. But before I get to the actual subject matter of this album, the real meat that I want to talk about, let's first discuss the instrumentation and the production, where I'll probably have the most positive things to say about Strangers to Ourselves. Continuing the tradition of their last album, the production is still fairly polished and streamlined, with cleaner textures and continuing the tradition of more Baroque instrumentation in terms of the horns and the strings, but with some glitchier electronic effects, like that filmy static on the first track, which would have been a nice touch if the sound remotely fit the rest of the mix, but really it only serves to make the song sound a lot more rigid than it really should. And the alarming thing is that this keeps happening. The scratchy fuzz across most of Shit in Your Cut, the warped hissing glitches of Pistol, the stuttered half-formed beat of Wicked Campaign, the dreary flat-feeling tone of Be Brave, and generally the whole washed-out tone of the guitars across this entire album. In comparison with most modern indie rock, it's not overloaded with reverb so much as the tones don't have that same texture or flow or vibrancy as their earlier records. And like most indie rock, the percussion does feel like it's somehow gotten more prominence over the melody on some of these songs. Thankfully, that's not consistently the case. There's still a pretty potent reggae balance to Lampshades on Fire that overcomes the washed out guitar tone. There's some solid grooves on the Ground Walks with Time in a Box, and the noisier, nastier The Tortoise and the Tourist that hold a fair amount of interest for me. And The Best Room and Sugar Bows, they recapture a fragment of that explosive, theatrical bombast that Modest Mouse can play off pretty well, even if it can become pretty exhausting. Hell, my favorite track on this album is the mid-tempo Ansel, if only because it's got a pretty damn great rollicking melody and guitars and drums that actually manage to get a little bit rougher. Now granted, so much of Modest Mouse appeal comes through in Isaac Brock's vocals, and it's where we run to my first issue. I'm not sure if his disinterested tone on some of these songs is intentional confrontational. We'll get to why that might be a case in a minute, but his performance really is mixed here, especially right out of the gate on the incredibly flat title track for me. I mean, sure, you get wild moments like on Pistol, but it's often so exaggerated to the point of cartoonish proportions, and it almost feels like a pose that I really can't take seriously. What I get a lot more of on this album is a very confrontational tone. Not so much outright anger, but sourness and bitterness, almost reminding me of the Arctic Monkeys, but with slightly better framing. I can appreciate it more. And with that, we need to get to the meat of this album: lyrics and themes. Now, let me stress that Isaac Brock, he's a damn good songwriter in terms of fusing his distinctive brand of poetry with the off-kilter melodies. And it definitely helps that he always paints himself as part of the story, not being above it. And you need to do that for a record like this, which thematically explores humanity's odd and often terrifying ability to dissociate from doing bad things from really affecting them in their psyches, whether it be from ignorance, stupidity, or outright malice. And Brock wastes no time in pointing out with a much harsher environmentalist streak than Nightwish ever brought to the table. People are petty, destructive, deceitful, and generally have treated this planet like shit. And eventually, our own consumptive nature will just end up destroying us. And for the most part, he's not exactly wrong here, and he doesn't hesitate to include himself as just being as much of a problem as you or I are. Now, the overarching question of this album is why we do this, what's our motivation, and whether we're even doing it consciously. And the funny thing is, we get an answer on the final track that might as well be summed up in the title. Of course we know. Of course we know the truth. Of course we know what we're doing. Now, here's the thing. Isaac Brock always includes himself in the framing of these songs, and it's said very early on that there is some dishonesty in what he might say, like on Pups to Dust or Wicked Campaign. And given the overarching themes of dissociation, you could make the argument that he's lashing out at the world instead of confronting his own issues and the depression that he feels. Hell, the one moment we see him do something like this is on Ansel. It's almost clinical as he discusses his real brother's death. But you know what? I don't buy this entirely for two reasons. First, when you have a dishonest narrator, it inevitably undercuts the overall message that he's putting forward. And there's a very strong message in terms of this album's themes. It's pretty blunt. Which leads to our second point. There's little to no real humor on this album. It's all played incredibly straight and serious. So what we're left with instead is a record where the view of humankind is that while we lie and delude ourselves to think otherwise, we're consciously destroying the world, and on some level, we know it, and we just don't care unless we're being actively confronted about it. It's just pointless, aimless nihilism. And sure, there are inevitably people to which this description does apply, but a blanket statement that humanity just doesn't care at all, it's kind of hard to support. And I don't think this album does a good job of it simply because it raises more options, because there is more nuance here. Ignorance, negligence, stupidity, despondency, a lack of time or energy, or belief that they can make a change. Most of these are referenced on this album, and yet not having be able to care is being equated with intentionally not caring, and that's a false equivalence. Now look, it does suck that the result might be the same in the end, but intent does matter here. And getting away from the whole philosophy of the thing for a second, a larger problem is that if your entire album has very nihilist themes, how people don't care or only care about themselves, and it doesn't sound all that attractive to the audience, it can start repeating itself or just getting dull as hell, especially when so much of it on this album intentionally lacks any sort of direction. And ultimately, a lot of it feels kind of shallow. Now, as I said, I'm conflicted about this album, mostly because the music is mostly agreeable, until the second you really start digging into the lyrics, where it starts becoming a little insufferable. And maybe I've been spoiled by really great records like The Lonesome Crowded West or Good News for people who love bad news. But you know what? Modest Mouse used to be more poignant and powerful than this. It might be the lack of greater detail and flair in the writing. It might be the nihilist themes that, I'm sorry, they do nothing for me here. It might be the stiffer, less interesting delivery and instrumentation. But the more I listen through this album, the more frustrated and angry I become. And yet, I can't say it's bad, because in terms of melodic composition, Modest Mouse, they still are talented, and there are many tracks that are very listenable and that I do like. So for me, it's a very light 6 out of 10 and a recommendation. But I gotta be honest, Modest Mouse has done a lot better than this, and that's the real disappointment with this album. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I know some of you are going to take a lot of issues with this review. Guys, I'm a fan of Modest Mouse. They could have done better than this, especially after working 8 years on this album. But until then, if there's anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or any other albums you want me to cover, I'd be more than happy to give them a listen. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.